Okay, so let's jump in. Triangle approach, I think if you have participated in the other two classes, snare drum and tambourine, I try to keep things as similar as possible in terms of my setup from one instrument group to the next. And for me, the core of all of that is snare drum. So I'm adapting my snare drum setup, and my setup meaning sort of my physical body, to the various things that I shift from, moving from snare drum going outward. And I think tambourine and triangle, while they seem to be quite different from our snare drum setup, to me it all stems from the same foundational place. So if you like, you can stand up. You don't have to. Again, I'm not going to make you do anything. You can sit there with coffee, your favorite beverage. You can doze off if you want, but if you want to participate, now would be a time to start engaging in this. So stand up. We did this with the tambourine class. We're going to talk about getting the body set up first and foremost. Even though triangle is a small instrument, everything we do as percussionists is a physical act, and so getting the body in the best possible position is important. So I talk about in the book the concept of the body as an instrument. So our production of sound, of course, comes from what we have set up first and foremost before we put sticks in our hands and before we approach the instrument. So basic principles, what we're looking at in terms of stance and posture, generally speaking, stance, feet shoulder width apart, and posture. Sometimes when we are teaching posture, we say things like have good posture, stand up straight, and those things are relatively meaningless in terms of an actual how-to. If we get to this concept of vertical alignment, I think we get a little bit further down that path to understanding. Vertical alignment, what we mean by this is that we have alignment of our head over our hips, over our feet, a nice straight line vertically up and down. In addition to this, we're thinking about our shoulders being down and back, which is a position that is sometimes contrary to the way we normally hold ourselves in life. You might feel a bit of a stretch in doing this and getting the shoulders down and back. This does have to be a trained position because we tend to fold over on ourselves if we're not thinking about it. We want the body obviously to be relaxed and stable. And one of the best ways I know to get to this place is some breathing exercises. So again, we did this last week, but I think it's always a nice way to start any practice session. We're going to do an inhale, exhale breathing circuit. To begin with, we're going to inhale for 4 counts and exhale for 6 counts. The inhale is through the nose. The exhale is through the mouth. That's all I want you to think about right now. I'll count you off. As we do this, particularly on the exhale, we think about releasing all the tension in our body. Vertical alignment, feet shoulder width apart, inhale through the nose, exhale through the mouth, relaxing the body as we do. Here we go. 2, 3, 4. We inhale, 2, 3, 4, and exhale. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Again, inhale, 2, 3, 4, exhale, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. As we do this, we are focusing on belly breathing. As we inhale, the belly will expand, and as we exhale, the belly will contract. So we want to think about that deep breathing process. As you've noticed, the exhale takes longer than the inhale. In order to help this, there's a little trick we can do. Again, repeat if you were here last week. This trick is having to do with the mouth and the tongue positioning. This is a little bit odd, but I want you to try it. The tip of your tongue, I want you to place against the back part of the upper 2 front teeth. Your mouth is going to be relaxed as you do this. You're not forcing the tongue against the back of the teeth, you're just placing it there. You will inhale again through the mouth for 4 counts. This time we will do an 8-count exhale. And as you do this with the mouth hanging loose, I want you to imagine blowing around the tongue as you exhale that air. What happens is the tongue sort of acts as a bit of resistance, and it will slow that exhale down. Inhale for 4, exhale for 8, deep belly breathing. If you want to put a hand on the belly as you do this in order to feel it expand and contract, you can do that. Here we go, ready? 2, 3, 4. Inhale, 2, 3, expand, and exhale, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Again, inhale, 2, 3, 4. Exhale. Have patience with the exhale. 5, 6, 7, 8. We do it one more time. Inhale, 3, 4. Final exhale. 3, 4. Really feel that relaxation. 7, 8, and done. Okay. So great way to start any practice session. Great way to start your day in the morning. We can think about getting the mind and the body focused as we do these breathing exercises. Okay, from here, even if you have a triangle and a beater, don't touch it yet. I illustrated this with the tambourine class, and I just mentioned how I'm trying to base everything I do off of my core snare drum approach. So if we're standing feet shoulder width apart, that nice vertical alignment, our body in a nice relaxed position, I want you to hinge the elbows up as if you were holding snare drum sticks. You can picture your imaginary drum right in front of you. All we've done here, we haven't changed anything at all other than hinging up from the elbow. So the hands are now essentially right in front of our bellies. From here, you can throw away your imaginary snare drum sticks. I want you now to hold your imaginary triangle and hold your imaginary beater. I want you to raise the holding hand slightly. So we're hinging up just a little bit more from the elbow. Perhaps the shoulder has moved a tad, but not much. And the beater, which was just holding the imaginary snare drum stick, is more or less in the same position, but it can come over a little bit closer to what we would imagine to be the bottom rung of the triangle. This is my basic triangle setup. And I will do 99% of my triangle playing from here. Now, you can release that, let it break if you want to take a seat. Not that that was hard work, but if you want to take a rest, you can. What is different about this setup, of course, from how many people play, is that it is not up in front of the face. So I don't have the triangle up at eye level. Now, remember that we are starting from square one, right? We are not starting from in the orchestra. So we're not basing everything about how we play this instrument, at least initially, from how we might see it done in the orchestra or how we know at times we have to do it in the orchestra. We're basing it on what does it mean to grab this instrument alone in a practice room and put it in the best possible position to start playing. Last week we talked about ergonomics, and the idea of ergonomics being adapting the workstation to your body rather than adapting your body to the workstation. I gave the illustration of a non-height adjustable marimba, either being way too high or way too low. That is the anti-ergonomics approach. If the instrument is way too high and you have to raise your arms up in order to play it, or way too low and you have to bend over, you are adapting your body to the workspace being your instrument. And I think sometimes, especially with accessory playing, and more specifically with tambourine and triangle playing, We are adapting our body to the image we hold of how these instruments are often sometimes seen in the orchestra. Often, sometimes, whatever that means. And there are many times good reasons for that. There are times when we have to hold the instrument higher because the conductor has asked us to do so. There are times when we hold the triangle a little bit higher because we want to see the conductor through the whole of the triangle. We want to see it through the instrument. There are times when we're asked to really show the sound in a way that goes beyond what we might do here privately in individual practice. But I don't think it starts from there. I think it starts from this idea of how do we get the body in the best possible position to do this thing initially. And those other manifestations are adaptations from this core, not the other way around. That's how we apply this idea of ergonomics to what we are doing with our instruments. And remember, this applies to everything. Another good illustration that I love to use with my students is drum set. Timpani is another good place to practice this. But drum set is good because oftentimes, at least when we're practicing drum set in a school setting, we're coming in after someone else, right? Someone else has perhaps configured the set a different way. Maybe they're a foot taller, maybe they're a foot shorter. Where they like their snare drum to be, how far away they want their stool, where exactly the hi-hat goes, the cymbals, how high, low, are they angled, are they not? And sometimes we just come in and sit down and start playing without thinking exactly about the position of all of those things. And the position of all of those things is crucial. It's crucial to your ability to play in the most effective way possible. And it's crucial for you to be able to play in the most relaxed and tension-free way possible. So always take the time to apply this principle of ergonomics to every single thing that you approach in your daily practice and performance. Okay, so back to the triangle. If you do have a triangle, we are now going to actually pick it up into beater, obviously. And yes, I do acknowledge that I sometimes take a perhaps slightly too wordy and analytical approach to things that happen before we ever strike the instrument. If you're not into that, sorry, but we've moved past that phase now. So we're going to start playing. So we've gone from that imaginary setup to now a real setup. If you want as a reference point to go through the process again of treating your holding hand as your one snare drum stick and your beater hand as the other, and bring them to that basic position, and then from there have our slight adaptation into our basic triangle position, then go ahead and do so. The result for me is that the triangle itself is about at a 45-degree angle away from my body. Okay, if I think of my shoulders as being a plane or a line, the triangle is extending out at about a 45-degree angle away from that plane. I'm very, very aware of shoulder tension, or hopefully lack of shoulder tension. And you can do this as an exercise. If you want to increase tension, simply raise the triangle. You will feel it in the shoulder. Okay? And even though the triangle is a relatively light instrument, for any of us, if we're going into a 15, 20, 30, 60-minute practice session, if we were to ask you to hold this position, even without an instrument in your hand, you would be very fatigued by the end. So perhaps you could think of that as, well, that's just my shoulder exercise. And if so, that's okay. But for me, I want to be in this place of relaxation. Same thing with my beater hand. So the triangle positioned with a 45-degree angle away from the body, and the beater hand coming to it. And you can see in your camera view of me, all of this stuff is happening at about upper belly or lower chest height. If you recall from the tambourine class, I referred to this as a strike zone. So this is where most of the activity is going to happen. Okay, so we're going to start with exercise 2-1 from my book, and I'm going to screen share this in a second. In the book, I refer to this as an exploration of sound. One of the fascinating things, of course, about the triangle is the sound itself, and how every triangle is a little bit different. And every triangle has its own overtone composite that it brings naturally to the table, and how fascinating those sounds are, and how we can and should get lost in those sounds. So this first exercise is to explore, is to try different beater angles, is to try different beating spots on the triangle itself. So I'm not going to prescribe a beater angle for you, and I'm not going to prescribe a place to hit the triangle. What we're going to do is play through exercise 2-1, which is incredibly simple, and we're going to explore the sound. So I'll screen share that now. Stand by. There you are. You're probably thinking he should have had this queued up. And I should have. He should know what page it's on. And I should. It's so many words, guys. Why did I write that many words? Okay, exercise 2-1, exploration of sound. So you can see it here, 4/4 time. Basically, this is, if you've done any of these with me before, you know I love the rhythmic increase, decrease. This is a very basic one. Whole note, 2 measures of half note, 2 measures of quarters, 2 measures of eighths. Then we work backwards. So try this on your own. I'll be playing it over here. Just like with tambourine, I've tried to find a balance in the mic level so that I don't fully distort things when I actually play the triangle. I'm going to play relatively softly over here. I'll be working at quarter note equals 70, but feel free to do this on your own. Explore your instrument. Okay, for sake of brevity, I'll shut it down there. So as we do this, we're listening, obviously, hopefully. We're working with the instrument itself. We're working off of what the instrument gives us. We are playing from a state of openness to how this particular legacy Black Swamp Triangle sounds versus my Artisan Triangle versus perhaps the able that you are holding, and how switching those instruments changes things drastically. How we are forming, of course, a basic approach from which to play, but how we have to be adaptive when we pick up a unique instrument and try to play a certain passage on it. So, as you explore those sounds, there are a couple of things that tend to happen on the vast majority of triangles out there. They tend to behave in a certain way. You may have a triangle that is a little bit more pitchy than others. You may have a triangle that has many more overtones than others. I was demonstrating on a legacy bronze triangle from Black Swamp, which is designed to be very, very overtony. But a couple of basic rules apply here. If we are striking the triangle with the beater at a 45-degree angle, this is assuming if we're playing the bottom rung, which you can play side too, but I'm demonstrating via bottom rung. If we are playing with the triangle at a 45-degree angle, against that bottom rung. That tends to excite and create more of a blend of the overtones of whatever that particular triangle is giving to you. If you play, say, straight vertical, that's going to be more pitchy. And if you play horizontal, that's also going to be pitchy, but probably a different pitch than the vertical position. That 45-degree angle, or honestly any angle in between, is going to typically give you the most blend. So, what does that mean? Well, the triangle is thought of as a non-pitched instrument, even though basically anything we play has pitch or pitches. We throw it into the category of a non-pitched instrument. And we do that because we do see it as an instrument that should be able to blend with other instruments, either in the orchestra or the chamber group or whatever else we're doing. So if we have that one isolated note with the piccolo player, and the piccolo player is playing a high whatever pitch, and our triangle happens to be distinctly pitched a half step one way or the other, that would be a clash that we wouldn't want. So they are made to blend. Does that mean that we always play with this 45-degree angle beater approach? No, not necessarily. Because playing either vertically or horizontally in terms of that beater approach and getting a more pitchy resultant sound can be beneficial at times. I think the most common use of going to one of these is when we're trying to get greater rhythmic clarity. So if we're playing in a more pitchy way, in a more focused pitched sound, and less of that overtone blend, we will naturally have a little bit more rhythmic clarity to what we're doing. Now, it may or may not be the pitch that you want or that you want against the orchestra, but it will have a little bit greater clarity. So you can change that angle and adapt accordingly. So if you're playing faster material, for example, and you want less of the blend and a little bit more focus to the sound, then we can tweak the beater angle. The reason I talk about this before saying, oh, you could just mute the triangle, that would clarify rhythm as well, is because we want to work with the instrument as it is in its most natural state. I like taking the same approach to any type of drum that we play. I think one of the sometimes unfortunate results of what it means to be on the orchestral audition circuit and how we have to approach that and how we have to teach it is that we start from a place of high manipulation of the instrument we're playing. So nobody is going to walk into an orchestral audition with whatever snare drum they're playing, whether it's a very thin drum or something a little bit deep, and have nothing on the head in terms of muffling or muting, right? We start from a position of, hey, let's take away that ring. Let's take away that excess sound. Which is necessary in those settings, yeah? Whether it's for decrease of volume or rhythmic clarity or whatever else. When we get a new tambourine out of the box, you've bought your new Black Swamp tambourine or Grover or whatever. One of the first things we sometimes do is we start throwing tape on the thing, throwing muffles on the thing, throwing moleskin on the thing. Why? To take away some of its natural resonance. I like the idea of starting from what does the drum, what does the triangle, what does the instrument sound like in its natural state, as it was designed to sound. And then we adapt from there when we need to adapt from there, but not as a default, not because, oh, that's just what you do. This is where exploring the sound, playing a very easy exercise like 2-1 is really good up front to listen to what your instrument is giving you. You can do the same thing with cymbals. You can do the same thing with a new tam-tam perhaps that you've purchased. Listen to the instrument. Understand what the instrument does before manipulating. Okay, so do that with any triangle that you own, and if you have a collection of triangles, know that they're all going to behave a little bit differently based on size, material, make, all of that. Moving forward, we're going to do a little bit of 3-note grouping exercise. We're going to jump down to exercise 2-3 in the book. I'll throw this up on the screen in a second. So beyond sometimes these sort of independent color notes that we play within the orchestra, we do have material that is a little bit more highly involved from a rhythmic standpoint from time to time. I approach this in the same way that I approach tambourine. I want to first be able to do this with one hand, one beater, before I start jumping through other hoops, meaning putting the triangle on a stand and playing with two beaters, or doing anything back and forth between, say, bottom rung and side rung. We will have a threshold of speed that we will hit at some point, but we should always be pushing on that threshold. So let me pull up exercise 2-3, which has the ability to be a faster single hand rhythmic exercise. 2-2 is also this. 2-2 is a 2-note grouping. 2-3 is a 3-note grouping. It's not a Brahms quote, but yeah, you could put this within Brahms. Basically 16th note grid, and we're moving the partials around. So as I mentioned before, I'll leave this up for a second, just so you can take a look at that if you don't have a copy. I'm a bottom rung player. I do almost all of my playing from there, and I do almost all of my rolling, we'll get to that in a little bit, at the bottom closed corner. The side of the triangle is a perfectly acceptable place to play as well. So if you play the upper side, for example, totally fine. All of the same sound principles and approach apply to that as well. It will be a slightly different hand and arm position, but only slightly. People who do play that side bar will also roll in the top corner as opposed to the bottom corner. And I have opinions on that, and I will share them when we get to the rolling portion. But for the sake of these exercises, you can play bottom or side. It's up to you. Okay, so if you have that exercise in front of you, you can start exploring that. If you don't, you've stared at it for long enough that hopefully you get the gist. And then a 2-note turnaround at the end. Feel free to explore this on your own right now. I'll play a version on my end as well. And again, I'm playing as quietly as I can so as not to overextend the mic level. We take a similar approach, I think, to exercise 2-1, in that we're still exploring sound. You're still dealing with what the triangle is giving you at different positions along the bottom rung. You're learning how much energy you can and cannot put into your particular triangle. How a certain amount of energy might overextend and overexcite the instrument, thereby making it harder to hear the rhythmic clarity of the notes that come after, meaning you create so much ring and resonance in an initial strike that the strikes that come second and third right after sometimes have difficulty speaking. As I mentioned before, the difference between playing this at a 45-degree angle and, say, flat or horizontally will create quite a different resulting sound. You can explore that a little bit as well. And obviously picking up a different instrument, picking up a different beater, will all have different things that you will then have to deal with. So it's an interesting type of exercise, because this is not a simple transition from, oh, if I can go to my my pad, which I happen to have right here. Although of course I didn't bring any snare drum sticks. But if I play these 3-note groupings on my pad, I should be able to take that and simply transition it over to this other instrument, and all is fine. All is not fine, because your triangle is going to sound distinctly different, and is going to respond and react in a very, very different way from a practice pad or a drum. So you have to live within that. The response of the metal on metal. The reaction of when I throw this beater into this bottom rung or side bar, what does it give back? What does it give back in terms of sound? What does it give back in terms of its sort of physical response, sort of that action of the beater hitting and then you having to pull off, because of course it's not going to give you much of a natural rebound. How much do I have to work at, say, the wrist level, or maybe even down to the finger level, in order to control and manipulate passages like this? So it's not a direct transition, as much as we like to think of it. Can I just take this and just apply it over here and everything is good? Not so fast. A way to bridge that, though, is to play with the triangle fully muted. So we take out that ring, we take out that resonance, and we at least don't have to, in that moment, worry about what's swimming around in terms of sound. This is a much more physical way to approach this, meaning we are just working on the physicality of what it means to throw this beater against this bar of metal. I think I mentioned this in an earlier class about how I do a towel exercise when developing timpani roll. Same concept. You throw a towel over the head of the timpano, and we play without any ring or vibration or resonance from the drum. Why? So that we're not worried about and trying to manipulate our roll within that at this stage in the process. That comes later, of course. But let's just get the physical throw first. Let's see how even we can get that. And then from there, we can allow the instrument back to its natural state. So you can have a little bit back and forth between the two. Okay? Experiencing just the physical, then understanding, after we really dial that in, what resultant sound will come across when the triangle is ringing freely. One of the other things that I want you to notice when you do this, with high rhythmic activity, is that the triangle is not a stable instrument. It is swinging as we are playing it. That might be on a small scale. And if you're playing with a nice big, hefty, heavy triangle, maybe it doesn't move so much. But it's going to move a little bit. So it is a slightly moving target. What that means, because it's not stable, is that sometimes it might be coming back into your beater as your beater is coming up against it. Sometimes it might be moving away from your beater as your beater is trying to come against it. And these are very, very challenging, nuancy things to deal with. This gets into, I think I've found a handful of things within teaching that are really sort of hard to fully describe. And for someone who likes to be rather analytical, these are always danger points for me. How do I specifically teach what that slight movement of the triangle might mean to how you throw the beater against it? And maybe it's just my limited teaching abilities, but some of these things I throw into, it's kind of like the riding the bike thing. I don't know. Yeah, there's ways to go about doing it, but you kind of can't do it until you can do it. Sometimes you just need enough times on it to really understand what that balance feels like, and then you know how to manipulate it. If I draw this back to playing timpani, this would be the same thing as, because we're playing a larger drum, especially if the drum's at a lower pitch, the head of the drum moves more. So as you throw your mallet against it, sometimes you get that head coming back up to you, which is when you get that trampoline effect as you're working on sort of that smooth roll. So same thing applies here. And I don't normally prescribe as a practice method, hey, you need to do this 500 times just sort of mindlessly, because I think sometimes that's not a good approach with a lot of what we do. This might be one. It might be one where we just get a set piece of material, 3-note, 2-note grouping, and rep it over and over and over, being sensitive to the nuancing that has to happen as you're playing a slightly moving target. Okay, so we have 2 more broad categories that we're going to talk about. The next is going to be muting and muffling, and then we're going to finish up with rolls. This is going to be a perfect pause point, though. If any questions have come up, we're going to address them here in the next couple of minutes. If anybody needs a stretch break or to go get a candy bar or something, now's a good time, unless you want to hear the answers to the questions. Okay, couple of things. Let's see, I'll go from the most recent backwards. From Yuri, question about grip. In the book you talk about using German-American grip. Do you ever change it? I feel as I bring the beater more vertical angle, I tend to have the thumb facing up. Such a good question and point. So the grip is completely based, of course, on where you are holding the triangle in relation to your body. You will see a lot of people playing. I will get to the answer here eventually, but I'm going to talk in circles for a bit. Bear with me. You'll see a lot of people playing French grip when playing triangle. And that tends to happen when we have a setup that is right in front of us. And this is a natural result of the triangle being up in front of our face. If you tried to play with quote-unquote German or American grip, which would be more like this, and you did this up here, you would have incredible tension in your forearm because you're trying to force your arm position into a place that it doesn't want to go. To release that tension, we rotate, and the thumb now is facing our body. So more of a French grip approach there, yeah? Because I hold the triangle where I do, which is down in my strike zone, and at this 45-degree angle away from me, I am more at that, again, quote-unquote German or American grip. So do I change it? No, not really. If I'm playing bottom rung for my rhythmic stuff, if I'm playing bottom right corner, I'm pretty specifically in this hand position the entire time, because that's the position that the triangle requires me to use based on where I have chosen to put the triangle. If you do play up here, then absolutely, I would say play French grip. Adapt your grip to where the instrument is going to be. Now, can you play down in the strike zone and play with the thumb up, maybe, or more rolled over? Sure. Yeah. I mean, if you are generally a French grip player, in that motion, that particular wrist motion perhaps feels better, or if you use a lot of finger when you play, then positionally I think it's okay as long as you're not causing any additional tension in the approach. So, good question, Yuri. That's great. Let's see. Let me back up first before I go forward. A couple of new ones have come in. So Timothy asked, what kind of beaters do you use? So I'm using the Black Swamp beaters. What do they call them? The Spectrum, I think. And then maybe I'll attach this to Ryan's question about teardrop versus straight. I use both depending on the playing scenario. I tend to probably default more to straight beaters, but I do use the teardrop especially when I have things that need to get sort of dangerously soft, and perhaps then come up to something quite loud, because I do think that it opens up our dynamic capability. But by default, I usually start with the straight beater. Try to do everything I can from that straight beater setup, and then work around from there if I need to. The important thing, and you know, guys, there's a lot of I'm trying to toe the party line here with Black Swamp just because I'm affiliated with them. There are many great instruments out there. There are many great instrument makers. So the important thing for me is not necessarily brand. Don't tell Black Swamp that. But more about just sort of the general quality of the instrument. So for triangle beaters, just as a thing, weighted end for me is the important thing. There has to be some significant weight on the end in order to really let the beater do some work and fully excite all of the things that are happening within the triangle. If it's too thin on the beater end, you're not going to get all of those vibrations, all of those overtones out of the instrument. It's sort of like using, you know, too thin a stick or something on a cymbal. It's just not going to get down to the depth of the sound. So as long as it's weighted on the end, then I think you're in good shape. Okay, let's see. So Paolo, to back up one more, I would like to know if it's possible to know about the legato staccato. So in terms of articulation, okay, yeah. So I'm going to get into some articulation things in our next little chunk, which is on muffling and muting. So some of that will have stroke implications, but a lot of that, for me, at least in my approach, has muting implications in terms of how I approach that. So we'll table that just for a second. Okay, and then one more from Brian. Hey, Brian. Where on the beater do you place your hand, and how many fingers are on the beater, or does it not matter? Another great question. So again, if I'm basing this on my snare drum approach, I am trying to hold my triangle beater, which is very clearly and very obviously not a snare drum stick. I'm trying to hold it in as much the same possible way. So it's thin, it's awkward. I think triangle beaters are awkward. But my grip on it, let's see if I can get relatively close in, is this. It's my open concert snare drum grip. So my control point, if you want to think of it as a fulcrum, even though I'm not doing many rebound strokes on triangle when I play, but that control point for me is between the flat of my thumb and the first knuckle crease of the first finger. I have an open space here in the hand. My back fingers wrap around the base of the beater. You can see the underside here. For me, and if you were part of the snare drum class, I do all of my control between that fulcrum point and then the middle finger behind it. So my back two fingers I don't really worry about too much. I try not to kick them off ever because that's a tension point for me. But they're just basically along for the ride. Okay? So as much like your snare drum stick, or perhaps it would be a more appropriate comparison, a marimba mallet or a xylo or maybe even a Glock mallet, just because the shafts are so much thinner. As much like that as possible. Okay. So let's get into a little bit of articulation and note length, having to do with muffling or muting, depending on what you want to call that. And then we'll get into some rolling. Okay, basic approach here. I mentioned at the beginning that I want to start in terms of my playing and approach to any instrument with letting the instrument ring, breathe, resonate as much as possible. I want it to make its sound. I want that to be my default sound, is the instrument making or yielding its most natural sound. And from there, if I need to change articulation, meaning with an idiophone like the triangle, but you could apply the same rule to, say, cymbals, or a vibraphone, or a set of crotales. I want to start with exciting the entirety of the instrument, meaning I want to strike the instrument and get the whole thing moving. As I crash my cymbals, I want to get all of them moving, regardless of dynamic. And then if I need to shorten the note, so this is dealing specifically with note length first and foremost. If I need to shorten the note, I will apply a muffling or muting to that after I have given birth to that sound. So I like to go into it thinking about the production of sound first, followed by the muting, and you might think, well, yeah, obviously, right? But sometimes I think we're thinking so much about the muting or the muffling that we start that action too soon. Before we fully excite the crash cymbals, we're already pulling them into the belly because, this is a short note. Before we have fully let the head of a timpano vibrate and ring, we're throwing flesh on it in order to stop the sound because, it's a short note. And we need to give time for the instrument to expand, to the vibrations to come out, for the resonance to really exist before we take them away. And I think that's important, especially in your triangle approach, because if not, you end up with short triangle notes that sound like this, which is hardly a triangle note. Now, that could be a specialty note, that could be more of a quasi-dead stroke, but it's not a nice, rich triangle note. So I want to start with letting the triangle ring and removing sound when and where necessary after it has fully expanded. Now, how do we do this? So we didn't talk about the hyper-specifics of the holding hand grip, so I'm assuming, with most of you, you've had experience with this. Depends on the type of beater I suppose you're playing with, but for me I use the sort of illustration of holding a Coke can or a bottle, something, maybe a glass, whatever. So basically we form this C shape. And again, depending on the clip or the hanger that you're using, this might be modified slightly, but for me, the clip or the hanger is resting on the thumb and the middle finger. I have my top finger on top of the clip just for support, and my bottom two fingers are hanging just off the top of the triangle. And this is where our muting and muffling comes in. It's those two fingers coming into contact with the top of the triangle, and if we really want to take the vibration away, bringing it back into the hand. Okay? So from this basic setup, your muting and muffling fingers are already in position, just hovering slightly off the triangle, and then a little bit of squeeze will take that away. Again, this is specifically with note length. So you can try that on your own, just a strike and a grab of the top of the triangle with either the pinky or the ring finger. You can try different note lengths. I mentioned earlier that we don't want to necessarily start learning the instrument specifically and only from the standpoint of how this is going to sound in the orchestra, but the reality is with triangle, let's be honest, this is where we most often see it. And along those lines, I want you to think about this muting and muffling as perhaps allowing a bit more of a gray area in terms of how much sound you take away. And I think this is a result sometimes of the fact that we practice alone in a room. And so if we are removing sound, if we're trying to muffle something, we want to muffle it completely. Kill all sound. There may be no sound left. We go from exciting the sound and then we fully deaden out the sound. If you think about how that applies to, say, playing music in a real concert hall, well, that isn't a reality. As soon as you excite sound, well, the hall itself explodes. If we play a big, loud timpani note, boom, that thing's going to ring for a while, whether you choose to mute the head or not. So in terms of how we muffle, and in terms of how we might apply this into a large ensemble setting, you don't need to grip the life out of the triangle necessarily to take all sound away. If there's a little bit of residual hangover, that might be fine, and that might add a little bit of life to your overall triangle sound. Obviously, there are degrees of this, the amount of pressure that you apply or don't apply when you're muffling or muting. But don't feel like it's black or white, all or nothing. Okay? There are stages in between. Now, where I bleed this note length approach into, say, articulation, when we speak of it, a lot of times we are thinking in terms of how we are approaching the note from the beginning. And this note length approach is talking about how we're approaching it from the end, the aftermath of it. But obviously they sort of swim together in the same waters. I won't go into too much detail with speaking about articulation in terms of the initial attack, not because it's not important and not because it's not possible to coax slightly different attacks out of the triangle. But this is different than playing timpani. This is different than playing marimba. You are hitting a piece of metal with a piece of metal. So as percussionists, I think a lot of times we like to make ourselves believe that, that's my nice big round open tone, and that's my nice sharp attack. At the end of the day, yes, I admit that those things can and do exist, even with triangle. But for me, they're a little bit further down the hierarchical priority list when I'm playing a piece of metal with a piece of metal. It's gonna be a relatively sharp attack, no matter what. So unless I pull out another implement and play this with a Glock beater with a synthetic head, or a very hard vibraphone yarn mallet, I'm not really nuancing those attacks in too many ways. I am more focused on how I'm dealing with the sound after I put it out there. So, articulation, if we're talking about, so Paolo had the question earlier, and Paolo, forgive me if this doesn't get exactly to what you were asking, but the difference between legato and staccato, which in general, and at least in our sort of universal translation of that, and of course correct me as I'm wrong, as I know you're sitting there in Italy with a much deeper understanding of the nuance of those words, but if we're talking about long and short, and the manifestations of what that might mean in terms of articulation, I'm going to do most of that either with the aftermath muting or, and this is where the gray area exists in between, with a little bit of finger muffling on the triangle while I'm playing. Okay, so this is another way to manipulate that articulation. And for me, this is done, just to get a close-up, with a little tip of the ring finger towards the top of the instrument. In order to take away just a little bit of that ring and resonance and vibration from the instrument itself. And yes, that will change the articulation, and obviously that will change the note length. And just like we did in that first exercise, we can go back through that exercise 2-1 with this approach, with no fingers on the triangle, with my ring finger barely touching the tip of the triangle, with perhaps the tip of my pinky touching the other side of the triangle, and all levels and degrees of pressure in between, which are all going to produce different sounds. So we played the other exercise, the 3-note group earlier, that is not a Brahms quote, but you could think of it in that way. I think that should be practiced in all ways, meaning I think you should approach it with the triangle fully ringing, making an appropriate instrument choice and beater choice. And then I think you should apply all of these whether you want to call them articulation or note length approaches, along a spectrum as you move from most open to most closed, if that makes sense. So in order to get clarity out of that, that was some pressure. That was probably too much pressure. If I would go to the, the full extreme, hopefully nobody would ever play Brahms that way. But you could see one end to the other. And then you can find yourself where you believe you should sit on that spectrum. The truth, of course, is always going to be out in the hall and not what it sounds like 12 inches from your ear. Because the audience doesn't care what it sounds like 12 inches from your ear. So this idea of hand manipulation and how much we use and when we use it, this is how we control some of these aspects of articulation and note length. And yes, we should be matching the orchestra and the instrument families that we are playing with, just like how we approach timpani playing and how we are pairing our instrument with others, assuming that they are playing some sort of complementary role in that way. So I have a couple of exercises in the book here that get to that. A muting exercise, 2-6, and then an articulation and note length exercise in 2-7, where I actually do have staccato and tenuto markings on these notes to indicate different levels of the triangle being muted or let ring free. With some of these things too, I intentionally am not applying a lot of parameters so that the player can move through and manipulate these things on their own. Meaning I think there should be some freedom there for you guys to manipulate. Let me just throw that up so you can see real quick some of these exercises. Okay, so 2-6, as you can see, what I'm calling a muting exercise. Well, we all know from playing orchestral rep, the specific note length and specific placement of rest, of course, does not always indicate where one should mute. But if we're practicing this approach, we can apply that parameter just to have a place to put it. So in exercise 2-6, we go from longer notes to shorter notes and different placements of those muting moments. But of course that can be manipulated in a lot of different ways. Those two half notes with two half rests in the first two bars, as you know, for those of you who play orchestral music, those could be, let ring the entire way. That's where we listen to the orchestra, of course. And then exercise 2-7, articulation and note length. We go back to some of our 3-note groupings here. These are nice exercises to play to really work on some of the extremes. Ta-ta-ta, 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 nice and open, then nice and closed. And then getting into, once we get to the second half of the exercise, ta-ta-ting, 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 ting, ta-ta-ting, 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 ta-ta-ting. When you speed that up, some of those exercises get challenging. This material, exercise 2-7, this is not aimed at the orchestra. Unless you're playing a pops tune and doing something that is pretty specifically outside of the Western classical canon, material like this does not often show up. But in pop settings it does. So I think it's worth knowing about. Okay. So last category that we're going to get into, I will pause here in 1 second to answer some questions that might have come up. But the last category is going to be rolling, which I'm also going to group together with faster rhythmic playing, because it's essentially the same broad approach to it, and we have a couple of manipulations that we will do in order to differentiate the two. The one thing that I do talk about briefly in my book that I'm not going to talk about today is two-handed playing. Not because it's not worth talking about, but because in terms of overall challenge, it's a little bit more straightforward than a lot of the other stuff that we do. What we're about to do is some of the hardest stuff with the back and forth motion in order to create rolls or one-handed fast rhythms. Two-handed playing, throwing the triangle up, on a stand and playing with two beaters is fairly straightforward once you have a good understanding of the feel of the triangle. Okay, let's capture a couple of questions here and then move on. Johnny Davidson, is there specific spots on our fingers we should avoid when holding the triangle clip? I wouldn't say necessarily. I mean, like I said before, I think it really does have to do with the type of clip you're using. I think the one determination you have to make is how into or out of the hand you're holding it. So what I mean by that is if you're using your Coke can illustration here, how deep we're putting the triangle into the hand, meaning how close does that sidebar come to touching the inside of the hand, or far away. Obviously, I think you're going to find a little bit more support the further it is into the hand, but I know that if I'm too deep, I have a lot of skin. It's a little too close to the instrument itself. So I usually keep it about halfway, personally. Okay, Andres, at an all-state rehearsal I sat in on, the guest clinician wanted vibrato on the triangle and instructed the percussionist to wave their hand in front of the triangle. Do you believe in creating vibrato like this as is good, or is there a better way to create this effect? Okay, so it's funny. It's like, do I believe in it like it's magic or something? I know that's not what you're asking, but this all goes back to sound exploration. It depends, I think, on a couple of things. One, the nature of the triangle itself. So if it's a really blendy, blurry, tons of overtones triangle that gives you a lot to work with, maybe within the relatively close vicinity of the player, we can create that effect. The fact of the matter is, if you're playing, so you were at an all-state rehearsal. I don't know if you're from Texas, but if this was Texas All-State, those concerts are in a 3,000 seat hall. Probably the person in the second balcony is not going to get the vibrato effect that you might get from either shaking the triangle like that or waving a hand in front of it. Now, me shaking the triangle, yes, it created a vibrato effect right here. Does that translate up there in any way other than what the trick of the eye often gives us? Probably not. But this is where, whether it's a guest clinician or a conductor, if they ask for it, and if they believe that's important, then we do it. And we try to do it to the best of our ability. Does it translate? I don't know, maybe. But we should have the ability and the openness to doing that. It's a good question. Tenuto still scares me. Would you mind explaining that? So tenuto, at least in the example that I gave versus the staccato marking, is just speaking about a contrasting note length to the staccato marks. So in that particular case, if I'm playing short, long, that's actually a very easy realization of that particular marking because it's simply a muting on and muting off. However, and I won't share this just for sake of time, but I have other moments in the book earlier where I think, do I have this? Maybe I imagined I have it. There are tenuto markings, whether I've included this or not. Oh yeah, I have. Okay, a little deeper in the book. So the next exercise, 2-8, where I have tenuto markings that are meant to be emphases, that are meant to be notes that we sort of lean into a little bit more. And in that case, it's just a little bit more weight to the stroke, a little bit more emphasis on those particular notes, a little bit of a lean, and nothing more. So it depends on how they are being presented in the material. And between exercise 2-7 and 2-8, I'm presenting them and using that particular symbol in actually two very different ways. Okay, that's a good question. Okay, so we're going to finish up here at the last 15 to 20 minutes or so with a roll approach. Again, drawing on my previous two classes, snare drum And tambourine, you know I love the rhythmic increase and decrease roll exercise, and I have this in the triangle section of my book as well. It's particularly hard on triangle, but it's a really, really fun exercise. And for this, I think one of the nice things, I was actually doing this yesterday. Believe it or not, my wife, who is not a percussionist, doesn't enjoy the sound of me playing music in the house. But I wanted to be able to kind of practice here and there and get my roll stroke going. So I brought a triangle in the house without a clip, just to kind of hold and play, killing all resonance so it wouldn't bother the other people in the house too much. It turns out it still bothers them, but you know, I can't control everything. So you can actually take the clip off your triangle, grab the side rung, and we can launch into a rhythmic increase decrease exercise like 2-10. Right here. Basically a build from eighth notes to eighth note trips, sixteenths, quintuplets, sixes, sevens, up to groups of eights, which are 32nd notes, and then a tear back down, repeating each one of those as many times as necessary. You can also see my arrow indications of being able to do this starting one direction, meaning an initial stroke one way, and then a reciprocating stroke the other way, being able to start off of either stroke. If you want to think of that as sort of a downstroke, upstroke. And I'll tell you guys, when I was recording all of the videos for this stuff, this was probably the hardest. This is probably the thing that I had to record the most times because it's just so awkward. In some of these middle rhythmic groupings where you're not fully moving to a nice, smooth, back and forth, fast stroke, the touch on the instrument as we do this is really, really hard to get nice and clean. So I'll probably poorly demonstrate some of this for you right now, but just know that this is a tough one. So let's see. Let's drop the tempo. I'll be working at quarter note equals 65. So to go back to something I referenced earlier, I am a bottom closed corner roller, as opposed to a top corner roller. So if you do roll top corner, that's totally fine. Just if you're holding the the triangle without the clip, hold it a little bit further down so that you can have some space to work up there. Now, the follow-up question is, okay, well, why roll one place as opposed to the other? And so for me, here's the reason. I want to keep my stroke and my hand position as consistent as possible with all of my triangle playing. So this setup that I use here, if I'm playing rhythmically, if I transition to a roll, there essentially is no positional transition that has to happen. I slide over to the closed corner and I'm there. Now, if you are a sidebar player and then you roll top corner, that's fine. You're pretty close to where you need to be as well. The only difference there is you're playing on the outside of the triangle and then having to come in to play on the inside. Is that impossible? No. It's just a little extra movement and motion that I don't want to deal with. The other thing is this. That particular stroke, this sort of side-to-side thing, is just, it's the same wrist hinge that we would use doing this. It's just positioned in a slightly different way. And it's not something that we do very much in other percussion scenarios. Does that mean we shouldn't learn how to do it? No. Yeah, totally learn how to do it. But it's not as conducive, at least in terms of my approach, to sort of this generalist percussioning that I like to do, which is, man, what can I keep as similar as possible so that I don't have to learn new tricks? And it's not because I'm not interested in learning new tricks, but it's just we have so much to do. So how can I simplify things a little bit more? Now, I will point out the one downfall of this bottom corner playing is that upstroke up against the side is also awkward. So one way or another, you're going to have to learn something that isn't necessarily something that you perhaps already have in your bag of tricks. So that upstroke is one of the more challenging things to learn, and getting that to be an equivalent sound to the downstroke on the bottom rung is a challenge, which is why I have this particular exercise starting both up and down. Okay, so if we take this exercise, I'll probably pause intermittently as we go through it. You would start out with this eighth note setup, bottom rung to side rung, at least if I'm starting with a downstroke. You can do this on your own. Eighth notes back and forth. The difficulty in doing this slow is that in essence we are creating two different strokes, a separate downstroke and a separate upstroke. We aren't yet connecting them, and that's incredibly awkward. So you will find that as you go through it, and that's okay. It is a nice way to sort of work on both of those strokes as separate entities. The next rhythmic grouping gets us a little bit closer, but it's still in a gray, yucky area. So I have almost these sort of quick motion, toki, 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 to. I compared this type of exercise in the tambourine class last week to how sometimes we work on one-handed rolls as well. And it's a pretty similar manifestation, meaning when we're going nice and slow, we're sort of playing each stroke at a time, and at some point we cross that threshold of when we actually connect those together. The sooner we connect them together, the better. Ya-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta. Now, as we get to the 16th notes, you can first practice this by leaving the beater against the bar, if that makes sense. So instead of cleanly coming off the bar, we can play where you're sort of sticking it to the bar, just so that you can get your bearings and get an equality of sound between the two. Okay? The 5 after that is where I start to get to my place of maximum discomfort when I am about to convert over to a nice clean fluid motion that incorporates seamlessly the upstroke and the downstroke back and forth over and over. That 5 is usually where I'm sort of in my greatest moment of discomfort. The 6s after that, and your pacing may be a little bit different, but the 6s after that, we should be able to free the thing up a little bit. You can try it by still stroking it out separately, and I'll try that right now, and that may not work. But if you find that that's too much sort of clippy, fast motion, then try to float it. So first, individual strokes. And then see if you can float the thing. Okay, so on one end, I'm actually using a lot more tension when I'm trying to stroke each thing, which is not necessarily a good thing. When I release that and open the thing up, I release that tension, and the beater is now coming off of each middle bar in a cleaner way. As you go from, here, I'll turn the med off for a second, but as you go from something that is fairly slow to something that is faster, I would encourage you to sit in the middle for as long as possible. Don't immediately gravitate towards, okay, I've got my roll, so I can do it at that speed and I'm good to go. I know from right there up to my fastest point, all of that I want to have available to me as different roll pacings. And specifically with triangle, because my one-handed faster rhythmic playing is done from the exact same position, I want that full range of speed in order to hit various rhythmic groups, depending on what tempo I'm at. So we're sort of, hopefully, killing two birds with one stone in terms of this approach. So we can play da-da-da-da, 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 da-da-da-da as a rhythm, and we could also play the same exact thing as a short roll. At this point, when we're practicing it with a full muting, there's not going to be too much difference. What I will encourage you to explore as you free the triangle up, as you put it back on the clip, as you let the thing ring, is then how do we work within the natural resonance of the triangle to distinguish one of those things from the other in terms of this is a rhythm and this is a roll. You have a couple of options. One is, as we talked about before, if we get sort of that flatter beater approach here, that's going to make the thing more pitchy, more defined. So each individual sound is going to be a little bit more focused, which might be enough in order to communicate the rhythm. If we angle it and play within that bottom rung at something that still is similar to a 45-degree angle, meaning it's striking the bottom rung at a 45-degree angle and it's coming back up to the sidebar with a similar angle, then we're going to get more of that blend and blur. Now, is there a back of the hall distinction between those two? Maybe not. Maybe not as much as we would want. And if that's the case, that's when perhaps a tip of the ring finger muting, a tip of the pinky finger muting at the top of the triangle as we're doing this is enough to clarify rhythm versus roll. A couple of other exercises just to throw out there, which are simple and easy, but I think effective, and kind of go back and forth between the muted and unmuted, are these next in the series. So short rolls, medium rolls, long rolls, basically playing a rhythmic grid or a rhythmic skeleton of some sort. In this first one, 2/11, 2 groups of 4/16 notes, played repeatedly muted, and then using, of course, the same exact rhythmic grouping, let ring. Then groups of 5s, then groups of 6s. And as I mentioned earlier, this is all meant to establish different speed capabilities for our rolling, which will produce different textures, different dynamics, things like that. Practicing these, of course, at different dynamic levels, which will have an impact, obviously, on your stroke height, how tucked away perhaps you are in that bottom corner or the top corner, versus how much we're coming out into the middle of the triangle to expand that stroke height. And as we do that, the impact that that has on the beater angle. So as I just mentioned, it's nice to be able to roll with that nice 45-degree angle. But as I use a larger stroke height and come deeper into the center of the triangle, I can no longer maintain that 45-degree angle roll. It has to flatten out because I don't have enough of the end of the beater in order to capture that as I increase the stroke height. So there are some things that by necessity will just have to change as we change dynamic. The importance of all of this, though, is really training the mechanism itself, whether it's this bottom corner approach or upper corner approach. That motion, which for me is exclusively a wrist motion. I don't generate that from the arm and I don't generate it from the fingers. It's exclusively a wrist motion. How we can control all levels of pacing from slow or moderate roll up to hyper fast roll. So that we know when and how to employ those things. And then, of course, the understanding of how we use one of those in a roll setting and perhaps use a slightly modified version if we're playing one-handed rhythmic playing in that same way. And again, those are easy exercises to practice. I'm never a big fan of mindless practice, but I do sometimes enjoy a nice sitting on the couch and just holding the triangle or tambourine or whatever, or a set of 4 mallets, and just moving my hands back and forth as I watch whatever I'm watching, just to further train the motion, and it's not that I like turning my brain off to do that, but it's something that I find if I can do that in a way that I'm not really having to engage with sort of the trying to do it, that I can just sort of actuate it over and over when I'm thinking about something else. I tend to find that when I come back to a proper practice scenario and put that into, actual exercises, that motion is just at least a little bit more well trained. Okay, so what I want to do is answer some of these last few questions that popped up, if they have at all, and then happy to end, as I have over the last 2 classes, with just hanging out for another 5 or 10 minutes to further chat. So if there are other questions that have popped up now as we get close to the close of the class, please type them in, and as I answer anything that might still be lingering, if other questions pop up, please ask them. Sorry. Okay, let's see. Well, the only one new question is from Michael. Could you discuss different metals of beaters and triangles and their combinations? Aluminum beaters on a bronze triangle. That's such a great question, Michael. And I love moments in teaching and presenting when I can fully own up to not being qualified to answer a certain question. And I think I would lump this question into that category. In that, I think these spectrum beaters that I'm playing with are bronze. And I've been playing actually on bronze triangles. How the contrast might exist between playing with an aluminum beater on a bronze triangle, or an aluminum beater on an aluminum triangle, or this on a steel, or whatever the case may be. I don't know, honestly. I don't. Where at least, that's where I would call up my friends from Black Swamp and say, "You've done all the testing. Where does this fall on the spectrum of sound? Is this one brighter? Is this one darker?" Beyond just listening to it myself. So I know from my triangle collection, which is these 2 different size Legacy Black Swamp triangles, and then this older, I think they called it actually the Spectrum Black Swamp triangle, which I don't believe they sell anymore. I think the Legacy Bronze took over for this Spectrum, and then they're sort of kind of go to the Artisan triangle. These are my. This is what I kind of work between when I'm playing. This one is going to be a little bit more pitchy, the Artisan triangle. So a little bit more focused to the pitch, maybe a little closer to, say, an Able, but not quite there. The Able is pretty unique, and for a long time has been really kind of the go-to triangle sound. They depending on the exact Able that you get, the Ables can be really quite pitchy, and the shape is obviously it's a more narrow top angle, and so playing from bottom rung to sidebar is a little more challenging on those, different from, say, an equilateral triangle. My most pitchy is going to be here. This old Spectrum is somewhere in the middle, and then the Legacy are the just really, really bleedy blendy triangles. And I don't manipulate too much between beaters other than beater size. And as I think Ryan asked earlier, going from the straight to the teardrop. the Stessel triangles or triangle beaters rather are really nice as well. And so if you want a contrasting metal, then that's a good option. But good question, Michael. I admit to not being able to answer that very well. Okay. Joe, essential sizes, makes of triangles. I have a 6-inch and maybe a 7-inch and wonder where it would be needed to get a 4-inch or something quite large. Yeah, so yeah, the 6-inch tends to be standard, and people will sort of expand from there. Sort of the 6-inch a lot of times is sort of, you know, the medium timpani mallet or the medium marimba mallet, and then we work to the other ends of the spectrum. Yeah, I mean, there's moments for larger triangles. Mahler, you know, if you want to pull out like a big guy for something that's it's not unlike instrument choice for any other instrument. If you are playing, say, a late Romantic or early 20th century piece where the orchestra forces are enhanced. I mean, if you have, say, you know, 100+ people on stage versus, say, in a smaller chamber setting or something that is a little bit earlier on the timeline in terms of our orchestral music, you will make different choices because of that, because an instrument is not going to stand up the same to this number of players as it will to this number. If you have 8 horns in the section, you know, just an expanded brass section, then, you know, your little 6-inch triangle might not always pair well. So it's not always a one-to-one relationship, because, you know, there are very light, pristine moments in you know, certain inner movements of Mahler symphonies where a nice small triangle is also very, very appropriate, you know, with the woodwinds. So and then smaller triangles, like if you went down to a 4-inch, you know, my personal uses for stuff like that has been more in chamber music and new music settings, honestly. I don't tend to pull something quite that small out in orchestral settings, because I don't think it competes as well, unless it's a really you know, if the orchestration of a certain section is such that it will allow a sound like that through, then certainly go to it. But for the most part, I haven't found as many uses in that way. That is a good question, though. Don't people always say that when they're answering questions? That's such a good question. Let's just say all the questions are good, and then I won't have to say that anymore. Okay, Timothy, can you describe the setup and general approach to playing soft rolls? I have a tendency to play an unintentional extra note on the triangle when I get in position to play the note. Yeah, especially if your hands are shaking, right? So yeah, I mean, soft rolls. So for me, obviously predetermining which stroke is actually going to instigate the roll. And if you have, I imagine if you're saying you have a tendency to have an extra note before you start the roll, logic would tell me that extra note is coming not from the stroke that you're intending to start. So if you're intending to start with a downstroke, that you're actually getting an unintentional upstroke. One workaround is, if you're doing that pretty consistently, why don't you just start with the upstroke? You know, if you do sort of a prep thing inadvertently, because a lot of times we do that. I mean, even if we're playing snare drum or something else, we have a nice little prep thing, then just start up. That's why I love, in some of the exercises that I have, you know, I love doing groups of 5s or odd number things. So you can start da 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 da. Start with that upstroke, and, you know, assuming that you want to end with a downstroke, but just flip it so that you're sort of playing into what's already happening. Now, I guess if I strip all of that aside, you may equate that to, you know, I've developed a slice in my golf game, and you're just telling me play into my slice. Yeah, you know, I think on some level, if you want to go and really, really fix that, then you got to get super intentional about not having a prep stroke in there. Again, if that actually applies to what you're talking about. But yeah, soft rolls, super small motion. It's like anything else we do. Soft rolls are tough. I mean, that's the very, very minute motion stuff. The surgery stuff, the operation game that we're really, really, really trying to execute a very, very specific, very, very small, very, very nuanced touch stroke on, again, a metal instrument with a metal beater. So, the odds are stacked against all of us. But those small motions have to be practiced, right? The small motion stabilizing muscles have to be practiced and have to get more and more tuned in order to fully control that. Okay, Michael, thanks. Hey, Mason, could you recommend some triangle excerpts or repertoire off the top of your head? Sure. I mean, it kind of depends on what we are looking for. I tend to think kind of in bodies of work. So Rimsky-Korsakov, I think, is a great, I don't know if I'd say a great place to start because some of that is quite challenging, but it does tend to cover a lot of bases. Capriccio Espagnol is kind of a standard classic thing to jump into. I mentioned this, Mason, last class with tambourine, of seeing the excerpts as sort of, and I mean, obviously, I know you know this from studying with me, but just to say it to everyone, seeing the excerpts as maybe some of the slightly more down the road musical excuses to apply all of this foundational information and approach. And flipping that process on its head. So I used the example last week of we don't teach xylophone by putting Porgy and Bess in front of a young xylophonist. We teach keyboard mallet skills for a long, long time, and by the time we have gone through progressive studies to get to that point, then we throw Porgy and Bess at someone when it's appropriate. And again, I'm saying this for other people, Mason, not you, because I know you know this. But that's how I would look at everything that we're doing with accessories as well. So I think there are the orchestral rep is more challenging, higher level stuff than a lot of the fundamental stuff we worked on today. Right? In the same way that it is for tambourine, and in the same way that for people who on tambourine or triangle are jumping into the Deliclus snare etudes or anything else just as material to play, there hopefully have been so many steps before we get to that. So if we're playing some Rimsky-Korsakov and we really need to dial in the what we were just talking about, that triplet figure, the back and forth of the bottom rung to sidebar. Man, I mean, there are obviously weeks and weeks and months of training and practice that have hopefully happened before going and applying that to Capriccio. Anyway, for what it's worth, Mason, I took your question and I used it as an excuse to talk about something else. But hey, jump into Rimsky-Korsakov. All right. Joe Smith, makes sense. Thank you. Okay, Paolo, thank you so much. Okay, Paolo, see you later. Paolo was coming to us from Italy. Hey, Seth, as you have worked with students across a wide range of ages, do you find common misguided tendencies or understandings of approach? Yeah, Seth, I mean, I think generally it's just sort of lack of approach. I think that's one of the main faults that I it's a harsh word, right? That's one of the things that I think is exposed very early on as we start to work with students on triangle or tambourine or cymbals or anything else. It's just kind of a total lack of exposure, and it's not even necessarily the student's fault. It's sort of an institutional thing, right? Like we have not exposed them to these deeper levels of teaching, understanding, learning, performing of these particular instruments in the same way that we have with the other instrument areas, right? Snare drum, mallets, whatever. So it's why I always go back to, hey, let's start from the core. Let's just build some fundamentals. Let's start with sound concept. Let's see, how we have to adapt and manipulate stroke. Let's take what the student already knows. Maybe the student has a really nice approach to concert snare drum already. Maybe they really have a nice approach to 4-mallet keyboard playing. Okay, what can we take from that and draw in and apply to this? You know, look how this movement is exactly the same as that movement. Okay, it feels different here, I know, but let's apply it and now work within the sound that this is yielding. So yeah, I don't know that there's necessarily any one particular thing where it's like, oh, everybody's triangle rolls are really bad when they're young, although that's it's a fairly common thing, but more just an overall lack of understanding about what the instrument is and does. And I'll say this: I use the rolls as an example. Triangle rolls tend to stay pretty bad because there's so much forgiveness in the ring of the triangle. So it's why I like practicing here, because if you can get that to sound even, obviously it's going to be really, really pure when you let the ring happen. But with younger players, that would probably sound like, and with enough ring, that like kind of sounds like a roll when you're 50 feet away, right? So, just kind of lay everything bare and really understand, like, okay, are you really delivering even strokes if we're using the rolls for an example? Good question, Seth. Oh, I said I wasn't going to say that. Good question, everybody. Okay. Brian, when doing a roll, I've noticed a tendency for the beater to rest in the inside, underside of my hand. Is this bad? No, I mean, we talked a little bit about hand positioning before. I don't think it's bad. I think it depends on how much skin. I think about these things in terms of skin on stick. How much skin on stick you think you need to have. I don't want to overgrip any stick or beater that I'm holding. But if it's resting in a certain place, if it's not causing any undue tension or not choking off the sound in any way, or not inhibiting your stroke, then no, I don't think it's a bad thing. Okay, Diego, how to choose which occupational for the new orchestral works? I'm assuming that's like how to choose what triangle for what work, I guess. Yeah, like basically what instrument are we applying to which work? Trial and error, as always. If we're talking about standard repertoire, well, you have to deal with performance practice. You have to deal with existing recordings. You have to deal with the history of how these things have been taught. You have to deal with orchestral schools of playing. If you're listening to recordings that are a little bit older, not old, but a little bit older, and you are hearing the able triangle sound, and we just assume that because we are hearing it with this great orchestra, with this great conductor, with that great triangle player, this must be the sound that has to be used, then I do think that is a little bit inhibiting. I think you need to think more about sound concept and what each particular instrument does in its setting. So we talked about this a little bit, Diego, I think, over the course of the class of, a pitchy triangle versus an unpitchy triangle, or a more blendy triangle, a more focused sound versus a less focused sound. Big and small triangles not always necessarily being attached to loud and soft. Some of the best soft notes that we can play in an orchestral setting are with a huge triangle and a heavy beater with an incredibly small stroke, right? So we have that nice dark depth of sound. It's like anything else. If you think about what type of timpani sound are you trying to put out? Dark, bright, beating spot on the head, stroke type, mallet choice within that. What do we apply that to? What part of that is understanding the orchestral repertoire to begin with? Are we talking high classical, or are we talking late romantic, or are we talking new music? But matching that sound, matching that instrument to that sound, the sound concept of the piece that you're playing, and allowing yourself to not be handcuffed to there is an absolute right and an absolute wrong to this. A lot of it is trial and error, and don't think, oh gosh, if I if I use my 6-inch this versus my 8-inch that, I'm going to be laughed off the stage. It's okay. You know, they're triangles. Generally, they're going to sound like triangles. So one may be a little more appropriate than the other, or a lot more appropriate. But at the end of the day, you know, if you're playing with nice touch and good approach to the instrument, I think you're going to be okay. But then going back and, if possible, listening to what you've created. Right? Listening to the orchestral concert where you've played this particular instrument. Did that match? Did that sound okay? You know, the climactic moment in this Mahler symphony, when I was playing the cymbal part and I chose 15-inch crash cymbals. You know what? When I go back and listen to that, that doesn't sound good. I should have used the 22s. It didn't stand up to the orchestra. So going back and doing a little self-analysis, I think, is good. Okay, a couple more questions here. Alan, I think you touched on it a little bit, but could you give examples of when you would use a triangle that is more pitchy or one that is more blendy? Yeah, so yeah, I mean, it's all the same stuff. Pitchy I tend to use for clarity. Clarity of rhythm, clarity of presence, right? And blendy being something that's going to sort of smear together. They are both color instruments, typically, tends to be how they're used, but one's going to smear a little bit more than the other. So presence has a lot to do with it. Okay, Mason, yes. Chris, thanks so much. Thank you so much, Chris. Seth, thank you for answering my question, of course. Joe, thanks. Yuri, thanks. Great. So I think that covers all of it. And again, just super appreciative for you guys checking this out and hanging out and asking questions. This has actually been this has been really fun. Actually, like, I thought it was not going to be any fun at all, but this has been a highlight for me each and every week. Like I said, next week going to take a little pause, but I'll throw stuff up on the Liquidrum social media the following week to get back into it. And if you guys are free, please do join and hang out. Thank you guys. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you down the road.